5.
All this censorship and treating people with contempt, far from protecting Europe from sliding towards extremes, is actually driving that embrace of the far right.
4.
I don't like being dismal, but I'd rather be dismal than wrong. And it strikes me that we're looking at 4% inflation this autumn.
3.
If we were to record data on who the perpetrators of rape, sexual assaults were in the United Kingdom, what we'd find would be so utterly astonishing, so flabbergasting, that it would almost be unpublishable.
2.
But we thought we'd have a new photo taken with our new svelte selves, didn't we?
1. We have liftoff.
Welcome once again to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Alison Pearson.
Hello?
And me, Liam Halligan. UK inflation surged to 3% during the year to January, Allison, up from 2.5% in December. That's the fastest pace of rising prices for 10 months and well above the Bank of England's 2% target. This, I'm afraid, is bad economic news, an ongoing cost of living squeeze, which means we're unlikely to see further interest rate cuts from our central bank anytime soon. That will stymie consumer spending and investment, slowing down the housing market and casting yet another shadow over the stalling UK economy. Chancellor Rachel Reeves claims this surge in CPI or Consumer Price Index inflation is due to rising food and energy costs. But the more technical core inflation measure, which excludes food and energy, soared to 3.7% last month, way more than the headline CPI measure, up from 3.2% in December. And inflation across the service sector, accounting for 4/5 of our economy, hit 5% in January, compared to 4.4% a month earlier. This is what happens when you put up taxes on business, which in turn feed into firms' costs and therefore consumer prices. Plenty of us warned Labour this would happen, but Reeves and Prime Minister Keir Starmer wouldn't listen. But thank God we've got you, Allison, in the Planet Normal cockpit to guide listeners through this economic morass. No voter on this continent went to the ballot box to open the floodgates to millions of unvetted immigrants. So said JD Vance to rows of stony-faced Eurocrats at the Munich Security Summit. His message chimed with UK pilots, resulting in a howitzer of a column in Wednesday's Telegraph, linked to the show notes to this episode. And ahead of Sunday's federal elections in Germany, Vance's speech incensed much of Europe's political and media elite, causing some literally to break down in tears. But anti-immigration party Alternative for Deutschland, or AfD, is going to do well on Sunday and could well become Germany's official opposition. In other news, Britain's most senior judge chided the Prime Minister and leader of the opposition for discussing a highly controversial court judgment in Parliament of all places. The horror! Our two most important politicians having the audacity to discuss issues of intense interest to the public. Do Britain's increasingly overmighty lawyers need to be brought down a peg or two? And then in other news, while JD Vance shocks Europeans with his rhetoric on immigration, fellow American President Trump is engineering a deeply imperfect peace deal in Ukraine, perhaps bringing to an end after 3 years Europe's most serious military conflict since World War II, in which over 1 million soldiers and civilians have died. But the most important event of the week, Allison? No, it's not the banning of greyhound racing in Wales. It's news that you and I, or is it you and me? We had our photo taken. Is it you and me? I always get this wrong.
Stevie Wonder song, You and I, brilliant song. I think we'll go you and I. I don't know. This is where my state school education fails me, Liam. Often when I'm writing, I have to text my public school educated better half. And he always says, oh, for God's sake, woman, fill in the sentence and then see what it says. You and I were in a photo. It must be you and I in this case. It's not you and me were in a photo, is it?
No.
That's what he'd tell me. We had a photo shoot, didn't
we? At Telegraph Towers.
Telegraph Towers.
I wasn't invited, but I came anyway.
Well, you were an honoured participant. In fact, guilty little secret about the Planet Normal mug. is we have never been photographed in the same place before. Now, if people were being unchivalrous, they might point out that we, in our previous sizes, we wouldn't fit it into the frame. But we thought we'd have a new photo taken with our new svelte selves, didn't we? So I think there could be a new edition of the mug with the updated photo. What do you think, Halligan?
I think it's about time, Alison, particularly after your massive weight loss and my less massive weight loss.
I went to this ARC conference in London, ready to debate weighty matters.
The Alliance for Responsible Citizenship.
Yes, indeed. And, as I said, ready to debate weighty matters. But the weighty matters that people were coming up to were asking about yours and my weight loss competition.
We spent years becoming heavyweight commentators. And suddenly we're not.
I know, but everyone's saying, how much has Liam lost? Anyway, so we'll unleash these.
Did you say more than me, but he gave me the prize anyway? Did you say that?
One delegate, I got into a very technical conversation about the proportion as a percentage of the weight loss. But anyway, we will unveil the new svelte photographs soon. But talking about soaring energy costs, I hate to say this, but the bill has arrived at Pearson Towers, not to be shown to himself, who is a boarding school child who doesn't think you should have the heating on. So I'm not going to tell him what it is, Liam. It's really bad.
There's a lot of it about the energy regulator is going to raise the price cap quite soon. So the prices are going to go up even more. And Ed Miliband, in unusually positive move for the country, has clamped down again on scumbag energy companies who are so-called back pricing. That's when you pay your bill, and then they come to you a year later with their hand out for more money for the same energy. Absolutely outrageous. It was outlawed, and yet energy companies are still doing it. So the Energy Secretary, to be fair, after a BBC journalist highlighted this issue of back pricing still going on, fair play to the Beeb there, some decent journalism, Ed Miliband has once again referred electricity companies, power companies to the regulator to outlaw this thing. But will those charges that they've made on customers be retrospectively corrected? As if.
Come on, we're not going to say anything nice about Ed Miliband, who promised during the general election campaign that we'd have £300 off our energy bills.
That is true.
But this now seems to be not happening until after the next general election, if then. And I think this idea that, they always blame it, there's a war in Ukraine, that's got nothing to do with it, really, has it? This is entirely self-inflicted.
It has got something to do with it, but what I don't like is when people say inflation's because of the war in Ukraine, because inflation, we're 3 years on now, and we'll talk about Ukraine, but when in February 2022, inflation in the UK was already at a 30-year high. It was already at a 30-year high, well above 5%. It then surged later that autumn to almost 11%, which was in part due to the spike in energy prices and indeed food prices, fertilizer prices, and so on. The world's press, suddenly they understood that Ukraine produces a lot and Russia produces a lot of the world's fertilizer between them, which feeds into food prices.
Yes, but because of this absolutely balmy, let's pretend we're hitting net zero while offshoring all our emissions, we have become dependent on foreign energy.
Totally true. Purely
as a kind of pantomime ruse to make it look as if, we are dispensing with fossil fuels while using other people's fossil fuels.
Exactly right. And this week, Miliband's special advisors, though not the man himself, finally admitted that electricity prices are high in the UK, in some cases 2 or 3 times other competitive economies, not least the US, highest electricity prices in Europe, because of subsidies to green energy companies. And this is something that the high energy costs as a result of net zero policies, this was the subject of a pretty incredible speech, wasn't it, by the new US Energy Secretary, a speech which you saw.
Yes, it's talk about singing from a different hymn sheet to us, aren't they? It couldn't be clearer that they are forging ahead. And the US Energy Secretary,
Chris Wright,
unlike ours, was, guess what, Liam, putting human beings first, as opposed to these grandstanding targets. And he's talking about raising the quality of living for all Americans. And by contrast, what's happening to people here, certainly at Pearson Towers, a little belt tightening will be happening after the...
But I don't know why you've had the heating on lately, Alison, because a speech by your new boyfriend, JD Vance, has been making you a bit steamed up.
It's very sexist. They're not all the men I admire are not necessarily promoted to boyfriend overnight, you know.
Emmanuel Macron was.
Before we get into Vance, can I just ask, obviously this inflation is pretty shocking. The Bank of England's job, as we apprentice economists understand, is to keep inflation at 2%. They've also halved their growth projection recently, haven't they? But what are they doing, Liam? When they were cutting rates, are they not fueling inflation, or have I got this the wrong way around?
No, I don't think you have got it wrong. I think they are completely out of sync. They are doing things that are confusing financial markets. So the Bank of England was very slow to raise interest rates during 2020 and 2021, when very few of us in the media, but some of us, were warning that after lockdown, there would be a big inflation surge because supply chains would remain in turmoil and there'd be a massive wall of demand. That's actually what happened. The Bank of England kept saying then that inflation is transitory, old boy, don't worry, it will be fine. Way behind the curve. So that's a big reason why we ended up with big inflation after lockdown and just until the run up to the war in Ukraine, as I said. But it was much easier for the Western policy-making establishment to blame Russia's invasion of Ukraine instead of their own policy failings. And yet again now, I think the Bank of England is completely out of sync. It really undermines your credibility when inflation is 50% higher than the Bank of England's target, 3% rather than 2%. And the Bank of England itself is forecasting, even before this latest inflation number, which was much higher than expected, that we would have inflation up at 3.7% by the autumn. And yet you're cutting interest rates. That makes no sense at all. And it's very difficult to conclude anything other than the Bank of England is cutting interest rates because it's under political pressure to do so, which is almost heresy for a trained economist to say, Alison. So you must never say it. I can. No. Somebody like me who's massively supported since the early 90s, I was writing about why the Bank of England should be independent. And when it was made independent in 97, I cheered that from the rafters. And yet you've got to question what the Bank of England is doing now. And certainly the idea that we're going to see multiple rate cuts anytime soon is now completely off the table, which will have big impact on investment sentiment, on consumer sentiment, and so on, as I said at the top. And why is there really inflation? There is inflation because Chancellor Rachel Reeves has whacked up taxes on business, whacked up the minimum wage. The business taxes haven't even come in yet. But firms are obviously, to survive, are trying to, in many cases, are trying to pass on that massive increase in employer national insurance that's coming down the track, big increases in costs in terms of the minimum wage, big increases in wage claims given the example set by the public sector wage claims, Labour caving in to their mates in the trade unions in the public sector within weeks of entering office. All this is hugely inflationary. And there are still big energy rises to come, it turns out. So I don't like being dismal. I don't like being a dismal scientist, but I'd rather be dismal than wrong. And it strikes me that we're looking at 4% inflation this autumn, double the Bank of England's target. And that is not going to do anything to get our economy moving. And it's going to mean, Alison, that the government has to pay ever more money to borrow. So these so-called gilt yields are going to go up, which of course mean the government has to spend more money on debt service when it's already the second biggest item in the government's spending balance sheet.
Do you think Rachel will still be Chancellor by the autumn?
I think it's very difficult to say for sure. I think the political turmoil that will be caused by Starmer getting rid of Reeves would be huge, the knock to credibility and so on. It is significant, I think. Renegades like you and I have been chipping away at her reputation just because very knowledgeable people have been getting in touch with us, our own inquiries, pointing out the holes in her CV, right? But you got the BBC now pointing out holes in her CV, right? Which is a change. The BBC even could not ignore this tittle-tattle. It struck me, Alison, right? I used to be a so-called FSA-approved person when it was the Financial Services Authority, right? It's now the CFA, the sort of main regulatory body for professionals working in financial services. I used to be an approved FSA person, which meant my economic credentials were checked. I had to go through various tests and so on when I worked in asset management and financial services. If you lie on your CV, you're not an approved FSA person. You're not an approved CFA person. Would the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who is notionally in charge of our main financial regulatory authorities, would she pass their tests to be an approved and trusted person that can literally flog pensions to Mr. and Mrs. Miggins? Probably not.
Probably not. We both thought, didn't we, when the BBC somewhat belatedly decided to run the Rachel Reeves' CV is basically cobbled together on the back of a beer mat, that this might be a sign that someone within Labour was, or even within Number 10, was starting to brief against her in preparation for the axe. But we'll see. Just two things before we move on to my new boyfriend.
He is quite good looking, isn't he?
Oh, he's lovely. He's lovely. What an upstanding gentleman he is.
See, there you go. Oh, it's simpering. Oh, he's lovely.
I admire the quality of his intellect.
You like a younger man.
I do like a younger man. Just to say two things. One, anecdotally, real trouble for younger people finding jobs at the moment, even highly qualified young people really struggling to even get an interview at the moment. And some very surprising conversations, Liam, I've been having with people talking about countries they're looking abroad to move to.
Yep.
And that has happened to me like 4 or 5 times in the last week, I would say, just at various events. And it's really noticeable now. And at first I thought, this is a bit strange, but now I think it just seems to be a trend. People are incensed that we are not only paying these absolutely extraordinary levels of tax, but the standard of public services is so low that people are having to dip into savings to pay for surgical procedures and so on. And there's just a sense we're going to go abroad and there's going to be better value. And if that is part of a broader picture, then the tax revenue is going to go down drastically, isn't it?
I couldn't agree more. I was having a conversation with a dear friend over the weekend. This whole digital nomad trend, right?
Yes.
It is going to seriously undermine the tax bases of the Western world. We're going to have to have a complete rethink about the size of the state, what the state does and doesn't do, what the state should and shouldn't do. And it's particularly the case for the older, more established industrial democracies like the UK, where, you know, our birth rate is now down at 1.6 per female. 2.1 is the so-called replacement ratio, which maintains the level of population. You've got a lot of people in the country now who aren't born in the country, not to cast aspersions, but there is evidence of this. You know, they're very good at not paying tax. The informal economy is getting a lot bigger. The off-the-books economy is getting huge. And as more and more of our high value-add people, you know, professional people and others live abroad, with countries attracting them with low tax rates, the ability of the state in Britain, in France and Germany and so on to maintain this sort of massive fiscal largesse is going to be very, very seriously undermined. And at the moment, it seems our digital nomads, you've got to be a bit of a weirdo, homeschooling your kids, eating kimchi and all the rest of it. No, you're now getting regular people. I know this in my own family. I know you've been talking to people too. It's now their game plan. We're going to spend, at least 15 years abroad making some money. And so hopefully one day we can come back and buy a house.
Yeah, so I'm said with a friend who's half Greek, and she's taking me off in the spring for a weekend in Cyprus, where there's a lot of a sort of development going up.
Am I invited?
Yeah, you can come.
We can do Planet Normal from Cyprus.
We could do a Planet Normal outing.
Yeah, we could.
So no tax on interest or earnings for 17 years, Liam.
Yeah.
Now, I have never in my life thought like this. I mean, it's a real sign. I'm British, I'm staying here, I'm fighting the good fight. We're fighting for our country. We're not going to bugger off, are we? And in fact, I won't. Almost certainly I won't. The fact that even my interest was piqued by this suggested to me that things are changing, because I've, as I said, I've always been very loyal, love my country. I mean, I know the weather's rubbish, but, I do love my country, and I feel strongly that we've got to dig in and fight for all the things that our forefathers and so on sacrificed themselves for.
All the things that are normal.
Yes, the things that
To
are
coin a
normal, and
phrase.
we will be defending Planet Normal. But nevertheless, now I'd be quite interested to hear from Planet Normal listeners. Have you or any of your friends been talking about moving abroad? And if so, where should we go?
Well, I remember this from the early 70s, because in the early 70s, the little semi-detached house in London, salubrious suburb I grew up in, massive family, extended family, mum won a 10, dad won a 6. Because the economy was tough, because there was lots of inflation, it was under a Labour government actually,
Yeah.
our house was always full of relatives who were either moving to America or moving back to America or moving to Australia or moving back from Australia. Same with Canada, same with New Zealand. These were, tradesmen, if you like, plasterers,
Yeah.
bricklayers,
Yeah.
carpenters, electricians, and their families trying to earn a buck because the economy was so mullered at that time. But now it isn't, so much tradespeople, it's professional people working on their laptops. And this working from home revolution, it's a long discussion. Many aspects of working from home are progress in terms of the human experience, but many aspects of it absolutely are not. Try getting probate when a relative dies. So many of the civil servants work from home. It's or get a planning decision made. It's much, much more difficult. A big reason why public sector productivity has cratered over the last 5 years is because of working from home. But that's an aside. There are pluses and minuses there. But this working from home thing is now literally morphing into working from the beach. And we know quite a lot of civil servants have been given permission to do that. It's not just people who work in manufacturing, people who work in very much tangible industries where you have to actually be there. You can't cut someone's hair down the internet. There's so many jobs where you actually have to physically be there. It will seriously hollow out the ability of Western countries, Western states, to generate the revenue that they think they need to generate to carry out the functions that their voters have become accustomed to. There's going to be a real political reckoning here. And there's airs of what Trump is doing here, in the sense that there was this completely ridiculous initiative by the OECD, a sort of Western think tank based in Paris, very much of the kind of European soft left tradition, I have to say. And this OECD initiative was that no country in the OECD, the sort of 28, 30 odd most advanced countries, advanced in inverted commas, would lower corporation tax below 15%, right? And Trump just said, no, we're not doing that. And the Americans could lower their, of course, the Irish got their corporation tax at 12.5%. There will now be, because of working from home, serious tax competition, right? Rather than a ratcheting up of taxation across countries, the EU and others thinking that tax competition is a bad thing because you want to preserve the size of the state. That's what that 15% floor on corporation tax was about. Working from home, digital nomadry, what Trump has done on corporation tax is actually going to unleash tax competition, which is better. Countries competing to have lower rates of tax, to make their states more efficient in order to engender competition and progress and wealth creation and prosperity. And you and I know, Alison, because we've discussed it a lot, that it's quite often the case that the Laffer curve works in economics. A lower rate of tax actually leads to more tax revenue. It's certainly the case when it comes to corporation tax in the UK over the last 10 to 15 years. And I've got the figures to prove it, and I've written about them many times in my Sunday Telegraph column. And I think that's now going to happen. I do think digital nomadry, inculcation of competition internationally on tax between countries is going to lead to a huge reassessment in the next 3 to 5 years of what the state could and should be doing in the Western world. And opposition politicians in the UK need to get ahead of that curve. They need to start talking about that, because that is where the debate is going worldwide.
I think that's absolutely fascinating, and also I think does tie into this Vance speech that you and I have been very interested in, Vice President JD Vance at the Munich Security Conference.
I know you like him.
You mark my words, he'll be there, he'll be there. Vance at this Munich Security Conference. Now, all the bureaucrats in the audience, they were braced for telling off about the appallingly low and complacent rates of defence spending in their countries, have been just basically piggybacking on the United States' might for far too long. And Trump had given them due warning of this, hadn't he? So there they were thinking, right, Vance is going to tell us we've got to spend another percentage point or whatever on defence. But instead, he unleashed this hellfire sermon about Europe failing to defend her borders, her culture. The greatest threat to Europe's security, said Vance, came from within.
Yeah, not China, not Russia, not Iran. It came from within.
As Western values were abandoned. Now, I think what's interesting, Liam, tying into this tax thing, not only are we being taxed to the max with extremely poor value for money. In fact, it's a great running joke at Pearson Towers when we do the what are we getting for our taxes? We think it's the bins. We just think it's the bins. It's quite a lot of noughts to get the bins taken away, I can tell you. But I wonder also whether what Vance was highlighting was that this lack of security in Europe, as you said at the top, how many times must we suffer these appalling setbacks before we change course and take our shared civilization in a new direction? Now, he was referring to another horrible attack in Germany the day before, where some young asylum seeker had done what they're, it's such a common pattern now, driven a car into a crowd, almost terribly injuring a 2-year-old child. There was another attack the day after his speech. So we're seeing these internal threats now to safety and security, and the electorate, as JD Vance said, that most people have not voted to open the floodgates to millions of unvetted immigrants, but that's what we've been given. And I think this, to me, that there's a growing discontent, which is that the various governments have basically unrolled out these policies, which the vast majority of the electorate absolutely don't agree with. As Vance said, people care about the safety of their families, their ability to provide for those families. And yet democracy is now under pressure, because if you tell millions of voters, this is what Vance said, that their thoughts and concerns, their pleas for relief are unworthy, invalid, don't even mention them, not just dismissing those people's concerns, saying we don't want our society being swamped by these people with very, very different values and so on, but shutting down elections, shutting people out of the political process. I took part last night at the art conference in a debate on free speech. So, hundreds of people in the audience offering examples from across the continent, from South America, of censorship. And the irony here, Liam, and what Vance was doing, I think, so brilliantly, was highlighting this bitter historic irony, because it was Western Europe, wasn't it, with the backing of the United States, which won the Cold War. So we positioned the defenders of democracy and free speech against the dreadful tyrannical forces behind the Iron Curtain. They censored dissidents, they cancelled elections. And now it's Western Europe cancelling elections, censoring dissidents, criminalising free speech, threatening to sort of clamp down on social media. And where has that got us? Because, as you said, the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, this far-right party, on Sunday is likely to perform extremely well. All the disgusted diplomats and military people at the security conference, so stony-faced and disdainful of JD Vance, and particularly because Vance went to talk to the AfD. Elon Musk has given his backing to the AfD. I would suggest that all this censorship and treating people with contempt, far from protecting Europe from sliding towards extremes, is actually driving that embrace of the far right. Our Planet Normal guest this week is someone I admire greatly. Alex Phillips is a journalist and broadcaster currently presenting a hard-hitting show on Talk. A grammar school girl from Gloucester, Alex graduated in English and philosophy from Durham, studied journalism and became head of media for UKIP for 3 years. She moved into politics briefly, serving as a Brexit Party member of the European Parliament. She was then a GB News presenter before joining Talk in July 2023. In February of that year, she joined Reform UK as a policy advisor to the then party leader Richard Tice. Alex Phillips has also worked closely with her old friend Nigel Farage. A clip of Alex Phillips saying she no longer felt safe in Britain, often being harassed by Arab men as if she was a Moroccan souk, she said, went viral. Phillips is extremely outspoken in her concern about the future of Britain. We have increasing numbers of men from cultures where misogyny is deeply embedded, she says. Alarmed by a dramatic rise in reported sexual crimes, Alex Phillips has now made a powerful documentary called Britain's Silent Rape Explosion. Alex, you've made a fantastic documentary called Heresies, Britain's Silent Rape Explosion. You begin by saying that rapes in England and Wales have quadrupled since 2015. Alex, how hard is it to get hold of specific data about who those rapists are and where they come from?
It's almost nigh on impossible. And actually, when we set out to make this documentary, we were planning on essentially only using data that is already openly sourceable on these sorts of statistics from other countries, from similar European nations, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Germany, France, because the UK constantly said, we don't collate this data, we don't collect it. I'm not sure whether that would be entirely true. What we do know is they certainly don't publicise it. But actually, just before going to print, it was your newspaper, it was The Telegraph, who had managed to get data looking at people's incarcerations by crime and by nationality from the previous year. So we were able to see for the very first time a picture in the UK of where our own statistics might lie.
Do you suspect, with all the work you've done, obviously, on the documentary, that there are active attempts to suppress the ethnic identities of men who commit violence against women, given this really quite astonishing increase over a relatively short period of time?
Yeah, I mean, without doubt, we know that there are active attempts to suppress all sorts of information from entering the public domain, from putting out any data which might be, however true, might be deemed to be incendiary across a range of issues and a range of topics. That is pretty much the modus operandi of the state and has been for some time. And what I find absolutely remarkable and indicative of where we're at as a society over these issues is police forces. When you actually appeal to police forces under freedom of information to ask for breakdowns of crimes by nationality, very often what they will tell you is, oh yes, we record that data on the victims, but we don't record that data on the perpetrators. And so what this does is give you a very skewed outlook. So if you were to look at other types of crime, for instance, let's say particularly things such as gun crime, knife crime, violent crime, you'd probably find actually that a significant subsection of the data there, the people who are the victims of that crime, are from ethnic minorities. And then you get to paint this picture of we live in a racist country. Whereas actually very often when we look at violent crime, where ethnic minorities might be one of the largest cohorts of victims, they're also often the largest cohort of perpetrators. Whereas this probably is not the case when it comes to rape and sexual assault, where we don't record the data, or we're told that there isn't a unified effort to record the data of who the perpetrators are, but more often than not, the data that we see on the victims very much does represent the data on society and the demography of society at large.
So coming to those statistics that the Telegraph did manage to dig up, which you do mention in the documentary, so it's the case, is it, that foreign nationals are 3.5 times more likely to be arrested for sex crimes than British citizens? Is that the picture?
That is exactly the picture. And that actually accords to what we've seen happen in similar Western European countries as well. If you were to plot the data on a graph or on a heat map, by state in Europe, by member state of the EU, let's say, you'll find that this is very often the case. If anything, actually, I think the data in other Western European nations is even more shocking, which makes me call into question if we were to record data on who the perpetrators of rape, sexual assault, were in the United Kingdom, what we would find would be so utterly astonishing, so flabbergasting, that it would almost be unpublishable.
Yes, I've been very interested in this topic for a long time, fearing, as you do, that British women and girls are becoming less and less safe. But what you describe as the harrowing trends in Western Europe, they are quite astonishing, Alex. Germany between 2017 and 2021, Afghan and Pakistani men 16 times more likely to be implicated in rape than ethnic Germans. Sweden, more than half of all rapists foreign-born. France in 2022 alone, 77% of solved rape cases were committed by men who didn't have French passports, and with men from North Africa and the Middle East being heavily overrepresented in those statistics. This is horrendous, Alex, isn't it?
It is. And actually, if you were to break this down even more, we look at that statistic in France, 77% of solved rape cases in Paris. That's solved. How many times are these not solved? Particularly undocumented people, particularly people who are not known to the police or happen to live or be resident in Paris. Also, we're not told when it comes to the percentage of people who might be second generation immigrants as well, people who have not integrated into society, who live in balkanized communities. So this is tip of the iceberg stuff. And of course, when you look at solved rape cases, how many rape cases are it beggars belief. If you look at this as well, based upon the area, so if you look at something shocking about those statistics, it's because they're in Paris alone. And I think this is reflected across Europe. So 64% of all rape cases in Frankfurt committed by foreign nationals. Where we've got those big cities, particularly where, and I think this is probably true across Europe, big cities and capital cities have the far bigger populations of immigrant communities. You see the statistics jump out. You see them absolutely leap up, where you're starting to look at 2/3 of all incidents of women being attacked are being carried out by people who have come into the country.
I remember, and you'll remember as well, back on New Year's Eve 2015 to 2016, when around 1,200 women, unbelievably, in the German city of Cologne were mobbed and sexually assaulted by men of Arab appearance. Now, Alex, we've seen these incidents, haven't we, flagging up what any reasonable person would see as very serious warnings that importing men from certain cultures was going to make life for Western women a lot less safe. What do you think's going on? Do they think that they can keep a lid on this? Having done the documentary, what's your understanding of how long they thought this was acceptable to allow this to go on, and what planning, if any, there were for the consequences of a failure of integration?
They might think they can keep a lid on it. What we do know is they're desperately trying to keep a lid on it, or at least stop people talking about it. And it's interesting, you talk about what happened in Cologne on New Year's Eve around a decade ago. And the thing you're talking about is when men, it's a custom really in North Africa, particularly Egypt. Men will surround a woman who's not wearing a hijab or is unescorted, and through acting as a group, they all sexually assault her and prevent other people from being able to get to her to help her or to see what's going on. It's actually got a name, which I think is tarouche. Now, we don't even have to look back that far. You can look at what happened in Milan, in the square, in the piazza by the cathedral, in the New Year's Eve just past. The same thing happened again. So we know that this is happening. These are two different countries, two different cities, and this has happened over the course of a decade, and the authorities aren't talking about it. Mainstream media is not discussing. So I remember 10 years ago when it started to emerge what went on in Cologne, we weren't just denied the information that there had been mass sexual assaults. Over 1,000 sexual assaults, all happening simultaneously on one night. We were told that this was not true. We were lied to about who the perpetrators were. And so we know that what they do is they gaslight people into not wanting to have this conversation. We know that in this country, trying to have this conversation, people are now terrified of not just being called racist, but actually being told they're making insightful or inflammatory comments, particularly if those comments are made online. And so what we can see is that across many European countries, they must know we've got a big problem. They must realise the mess that we're in. They're too lily-livered to take any sort of affirmative action to deal with it. And so the only thing they can do is attack anybody trying to whistle-blow on the issue, to try and essentially bury it and not make matters worse by essentially provoking further outrage.
I remember writing about the Cologne incident, and I think the only politician who engaged in that discussion was Nigel Farage, and there was a resounding silence from everyone else. Now, just moving on to the rise in not just rapes, but what you might call alien crimes in the UK, crimes not previously known in our country, acid attacks, female genital mutilation, and so-called honour crime. Alex, I actually hate the term honour crime because there's nothing honourable about attacking your child because she's become too Western. Is this another, do you think, topic where there are probably maybe thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of actually young Muslim women and girls who are treated very differently in our country, although being born British?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. To put this into context, this is a very staggering statistic. There's been a 69% rise in acid attacks in the UK since 2022. We now have the highest number of recorded acid attacks in the world. In the world. And, you've got to ask yourself, was this going on in the 1950s, the 1960s, people throwing corrosive substances on other people? You also know instinctively, don't you, that when there's been an acid attack, you know what the profile of the perpetrator is going to be. I think back to Abdul Azizi, and we weren't told, this is the remarkable thing, man is on the loose, man could have dangerous substance on him, man has thrown acid on a woman, was missing for, how many, was it days? I don't know, on the loose for a long time. And at no point did they tell us what he looked like. They said, he might have injuries to his face where some acid might have gone on him. That's great. If we're trying to look at someone who's just carried out a violent attack and may go on to attack other people, might it help to tell us what he looks like? But they're too afraid to even do that in an instance where someone's actually on the loose. And you mention other crimes, such as the so-called honour killings, which is child abuse or just infanticide by any other name. FGM, there has been only one successful prosecution of FGM in this country, despite thousands of recorded incidents. And then you've even got an uptick in crimes such as attacks using voodoo dolls and things like that. And you know that usually when it comes to the latter and things like honour killings, these are happening community on community. This is happening within a family. This is happening within a specific community. This isn't people who have come to this country attacking native-born citizens. But again, we have become a hotbed of housing these barbaric medieval practices from other countries, where in this country, they're outlawed in the countries of origin as well, I'm pretty sure. But in this country, they should be muscularly prevented.
We know, though, if we just take a clear-eyed look at what's going on around the world, Iraq recently lowered the age of consent to 9. So a little girl can be married off. The Taliban have banned women, not just do they have to cover themselves up, they've banned them from even speaking in public. We know your documentary said that in Germany there are 416,000 Afghan migrants. We can imagine that most of them are male. A huge proportion of the people coming across in small boats across the Channel are Afghan and Iraqi and Pakistani and Somalian. I don't even know how to phrase this question, Alex, to be honest with you. I mean, common sense tells us that people don't check their cultural habits and attitudes when they hit the Kent coast, do they?
No, this is what's so remarkable. We are not taking the victims from these countries. We're not taking the oppressed. We're not taking the Yazidi girls. We're not taking the Afghan women who will be stoned to death or are forced to live in silence, even in their own homes, who can't play music, who must cover from head to toe, who must always have a male escort. We're not trying to rescue girls from child marriages in Iraq. We're taking the oppressors. We're taking essentially the perpetrators of these acts because they have become so widespread and they're so normalized in these countries of origin. We're bringing these men with these violent, misogynistic cultural values, if you could call them values, over to this country, and then putting them into a hypersexualized, highly liberated world where girls, so it's two things are going on here. You are creating this toxic cocktail because you're bringing men with barbarian attitudes over to a country where girls are told sexual liberty, even permissiveness, empowering, and at the same time are also being told, if you are worried, if your heckles go up, if there's hair stand up on the back of your neck because a man is from a different culture, you're probably a racist. And young women are the most likely to adopt this sort of internalized critical race theory approach to life. They're the ones who are most likely to imbue those increasing narratives that are woven through education, that to have a bad thought about someone from a different country is racist, that to consider a man who's come over on a boat as anything other than a poor victim who we must bend over backwards to help is racist. You put all of that together, and what you've got is a picture where things are going to go wrong.
In your documentary, a Muslim women's rights activist talks about Islamic attitudes to women, the Quran saying women's testimony in court is worth half of that of a male testimony, Muslim men being allowed to discipline their wives and so on. Is there an incompatibility between strict Islamic teaching and British freedoms? And how does that then lead to the grooming child rape gangs?
Yeah, without doubt, of course there is. We know there's an incompatibility between the customs of certain cultures, which have now become embedded in ghettoized communities, and the customs of the West, between Islam and the West, which is a fundamentally Judeo-Christian society. And the problem we have here is we're still not allowed to really talk about that in the open. We're still not able to defend those Judeo-Christian values. And with some of my guests actually went into the teachings of the Quran. And it's evident, isn't it? We don't really have to be experts in Arabic to notice that it's the tradition in the Islamic faith for women to have to cover themselves up. And this is actually used as a device in Muslim communities to identify proper chaste Muslim women from women who are not. And there are passages in the Quran which essentially says, when it comes to the proper chaste Muslim women, she gets treated one way. If a woman doesn't want to live in that respectful manner, then essentially, at a time of war especially, she can be taken as a sex slave. And the question then is whether or not the Muslim communities or members of the Muslim communities in the West consider themselves to be at a war footing with the West. And I would say for a great number of them, the answer is yes.
Yes, I was talking over the weekend. A friend, he is from North Africa and he's a secular person, but a Muslim by upbringing. And he says that the Western liberals are so naive because he said his people just think that we're not going to heaven, we're going to hell. So there's a completely different attitude to Western women than there is to chaste Muslim women. And again, Alex, this is obviously just not spoken about. Were you heartened? I thought recently, having written about this topic for many years, we finally saw, in the light of Elon Musk's comments on what had been going on with the rape gangs, we actually saw the words Pakistani origin child rape gangs as opposed to the sort of the more euphemistic grooming gangs things. Do you think that there is any progress? And what do you think about the failure to have a statutory national inquiry into the rape gangs?
So was I heartened? Absolutely not. Quite the opposite. What really stuck out for me is it took somebody from a different country in a different country about 10 years, 15 years, 20 years after these grotesque acts were perpetrated, a decade after we learnt about them for the first time in the United Kingdom, to suddenly go, whoa, this is actually going on somewhere. Like, how is this going on in Britain? And his horror and shock, and the world's horror and shock at learning about this, really held a mirror up to our own country. And if it takes someone from outside of this country to learn about it and go, blimmin' heck, this is really disturbing, you can see the cover up and the level of suppression that's been taking place here. Because what has happened since we first learned in this country about Muslim rape gangs? Nothing. The only thing that has happened is the demonization and persecution of those who try and speak out about it. And actually, almost a criminalization of anybody who might think of taking to the street, holding a placard and saying, protect our girls. That's just absolutely unthinkable. People would worry that they'd wind up in prison for doing something like that, particularly following what happened in the aftermath of Southport. So am I heartened? No, quite the opposite, because what I've seen is yet again no discernible action on saying, how are we going to tackle this? How are we going to speak to the perpetrators? How are we going to talk to communities where this is normalized? How are we going to reduce levels of immigration? How are we going to tell young girls that actually you ought to be cautious? These are valuable life lessons to have, particularly when dealing with men from vastly different cultural backgrounds. None of that has taken place. Instead, we've got an ongoing conversation about Islamophobia and criminalizing talking out about the religion and the embedded cultural practices. We've got the refusal of any sort of inquiry that would have teeth and be able to tackle these issues head on and not just talk. The problem I've got with inquiries in Britain is they cost millions of pounds and take years in the making, and then nothing's implemented. There's not a single fundamental policy change. And all the while, all of this is happening, we've still got record levels of immigration. So am I at all heartened by the fact that for a brief moment only, it started going viral international, how bad the problem is in Britain? No, it actually horrified me and woke me up to how we're all sleepwalking and being forced to sleepwalk throughout this situation.
Of course, Elon Musk was criticised, wasn't he, for having the temerity to point out these, as you say, absolutely grotesque things which people abroad simply couldn't believe had been allowed to go on and fester here. Now, if we look at some of these European countries where those astonishing, shocking rape stats come from, Germany has started negotiating with the Taliban, is paying to send Afghan men back. We're seeing much more effective repatriation starting. We've got Denmark, formerly the moral superpower as Denmark and the other Scandinavian countries, when they were admitting all these migrants, were priding themselves on their marvellous open-mindedness. Now we've seen Denmark pretty much reduce immigration to nothing. Looking ahead with your Mystic Meg Gypsy Rose hat on, what do you see happening here? Do you think there will come a crisis or something will happen which will make those kind of solutions a possibility in the UK?
We live in a perma-crisis anyway. We know that because that's why the government is having to be, the state is having to be so heavy-handed at trying to prevent people from going out and protesting and saying, okay, we've woken up to what's going on and we're not happy about it. The only way we're going to even begin on the pathway to creating policy to address the situation is a change of government and, frankly, a change from the two legacy parties. And probably, therefore, in the form of Nigel Farage, in the form of Reform UK, who at the moment are being quite timid and quite cautious in how they talk about this matter. I would argue too timid and too cautious, although perhaps this is having a positive effect on the polling at present. But Nigel Farage has always been a vanguard on various topics that the political elites have been far too cowardly to touch. And I think we need him and we need Reform to be a vanguard once again, because we're now beginning to see the conversation around this is becoming acceptable. The Overton window shifting, a phrase I'm hearing far too much in this. The Overton window shifted so much that huge tranches of the general public are far ahead of even Reform UK right now when it comes to this topic. But how we do deal with this as a country is it's going to ask us some very difficult questions. It's going to tempt us with some very ugly policies that at one point would have seemed unconscionable, but are now going to have to be openly and realistically talked about. And that's going to be a very difficult situation for this country to be in.
Alex, do you think we could say that there are men and boys from certain regions and belief systems who it's just not safe to have in our country? Would you ban immigration on the basis of cultural incompatibility, bearing in mind, obviously, certain skills that we need. But do you think going forward, that's one of the solutions?
It has to be, and I don't see any problem in that. A country's first duty is to protect its own citizens. And also, it's not just about, are you coming from a country where you have a very different cultural normatives to us? It's about what class of that country you come from. Because very often, if you've got an educated nuclear scientist emanating from Pakistan, the likelihood is he's got perfect English, shares Western values and Western practices, would be sending his daughters to school and encouraging them to go on to be scientists themselves. Most likely, not in every case, but that is what the most likely scenario is. You've also got to look at these countries and break them down by region in a particular country, because a country as diverse as Pakistan has very different cultural practices in different states in Pakistan. But if we don't have a discriminatory immigration policy, which all immigration policies should discriminate. It should discriminate on whether someone's got the skills to be in that country or not, whether someone's of a sort of economically active working age. And I think we absolutely should add to that culture, because unless we do that, we're essentially performing an act of cultural vandalism against our own country. Now, the difficulty is, and this is where I was alluding earlier to the fact that Britain's going to have to start making very complicated choices and decisions, is when you look at where, particularly the rape gangs, when you look at who are the perpetrators and who are carrying out these acts, these people have not necessarily come into the country in the last few years or come into the country and decided to do this. There'll be a great many who have come into the country quite recently, but a lot of embedded attitudes, which are massively anti-Western, are coming from the second, third and fourth born immigrant children. What we found is a lot of people who came over in the 60s sang God Save the Queen, wanted to make cups of tea and loved the idea of living in Britain. And so therefore we expected their children to just dissolve into society and become increasingly anglicised. In some situations, the opposite has happened. So then what do you do about this when these people are essentially born and bred in Britain, British citizens, but are almost living in a fifth column, a completely separate state in Britain, a state within a state? How do you deal with that? And that's where it's going to start getting very difficult, because for most members of the public, it's very hard to discern, oh, this person is the sort of immigrant or the sort of Muslim or the sort of African, whatever it may be, who's one of us, who's integrated, and this person isn't, just on appearance alone. So you can understand why the government and the authorities are very timid about how to handle this and talk about this, because the last thing we want as a nation are marauding thugs going around, looking at people, basing judgments on the colour of their skin, and then making the lives of integrated communities, integrated families, extremely difficult and uncomfortable. But at the same time, you cannot say, okay, we're going to go down that route, and the victim therefore has to be little white girls. And if you ask yourself this question, if there was a trend in the United Kingdom where it was white men going out and picking on the daughters of immigrant families, to groom, to rape, to sexualise, very often underage girls, if it was the other way round, could you imagine the government being so inactive? We're constantly told we live in some sort of racist society. And yet, if I try and stretch my mind to think where there's been a racist attack in the UK, the only name that automatically springs to mind that made loads of headlines, and absolutely rightly, was Stephen Lawrence. Now, this is 30 years ago. If there had been a racist attack since then, white people going out to deliberately hurt, kill, assault, abuse minority communities, we would know the names of the victims because there would have been a huge media furore around it. So that tells me actually that the problem of white on minority abuse and assault is vanishingly small. So I think we need to wake up and start defending our own citizens, our own children, and that might bring a degree of discomfort. It's a very difficult question for any state to answer, for any authorities to have to tackle. But actually being too wimpy about doing it or just ignoring it, hoping it will go away, that's not sustainable.
Alex, I obviously welcome your forthrightness, and I suspect that one reason that you and I both get very exercised about this is because we come from white working class backgrounds originally, and we see these girls treated as, I think the former Home Secretary Jack Straw said, they're regarded as easy meat. And that makes us incredibly upset and angry. Not only are you talking about this sort of state anxiety and cover up about the failures of multiculturalism, we've recently seen the Lady Chief Justice criticising Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch for last week's PMQs, where they, both the Tory leader and the Prime Minister, criticised the judge who had allowed a Palestinian family into the UK under the Ukraine migration system. We've got this other problem, haven't we, Alex, with a sort of liberal intelligentsia manifesting in our judicial system, where values which, as you say, should be protecting British citizens from Hamas-infiltrated Gazans probably coming here, which I think most people from where we come from was stark staring mad. But we have an elite cadre of judges who see the rights of those people as more important than the rights of the British people. Is that correct?
Worse than that, they see these people as automatically sacrosanct or beatified because they've come from that region, despite the fact that region is riddled with terrorism and extremism. And the worry I have is if that's the cohort of judges right now, so we're largely talking about people in, let's say, their 50s, the next judges coming up have been educated in universities that are absolutely brainwashed with this stuff, where this is absolutely baked in. And equally, and this is something that I don't think is being spoken about enough, but as our demography radically changes, you're going to find more and more people within those positions of power and authority making the decisions that affect this country, coming from the communities that then tend to rally around, defend each other and cover things up. And so then what situation are we going to be in? We know what happened with the rape gangs is there'd be people on local councils who were also from the Muslim or Pakistani community who desperately didn't want to address this issue because their first port of call is to defend their own. Now, when those people increasingly start to populate our courts, our legal system, parliament, etc., we're going to find it ever more difficult to run to the defence of our women and our girls. So this situation is only going to increasingly get worse. I think that there is malevolence as well within certain members of certain communities where this is an ambition. And unless we actually wake up and talk about it, we're going to end up in an irreversible situation if we haven't ended up there already.
Finally, I really value your political antennae, Alex. You're a Brexit MEP. I think you're now supporting Reform UK. I know you're a good friend of Nigel Farage. Can I ask you just to look forward? How do you think Kemi Badenoch is doing? And do you think, as I do, that some sort of pact between Reform and the Conservatives will be inevitable?
People are talking about that. My answer is I really hope not. I hope that actually Reform are able to win decisively. I think the people clinging to the idea that it's got to be the Conservatives really needs to die a death now, because we have seen what the Conservatives have done. A lot of the problems that we've spoken about today happened under a Conservative Party watch. The Conservative Party are more interested in their own existence, especially among a small cadre of people in the Conservative Party, than they are about national interest. I have strong suspicions that there are people, or there's at least one or two people in Reform right now who are essentially working on behalf of the Conservative Party. That's always been the case. The Conservative Party have desperately tried to infiltrate, shadow box, and then demonise a Nigel Farage-led party in order to then regain control. But every time that this has happened, and whether it be UKIP or the Brexit Party has stepped aside and allowed the Conservative Party to win with majorities, they have failed the nation. And there's been a great wake-up call. I think in the last general election, what we saw is not people going out and voting for Labour. The Labour Party vote share had dropped quite significantly. They were voting the Conservative Party out. What we're seeing now is Reform polling extremely well. And I think that is because that we've reached a situation where not most of the population, huge numbers of the population are saying, I cannot ever vote for Labour. And I'm going to find it very difficult to ever vote the Conservative Party back in. There's not been a whole-scale change of the Conservative Party. The people behind the scenes who run the show are the same people who've been doing it for 10, 15 years. Put them back at the helm and you're going to have the same situation all over again. Don't be deceived by it. So no, I hope there isn't an electoral pact, but it's still a David versus Goliath situation for Reform UK. They don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the experience, they're incredibly vulnerable to infiltration and attack by the Conservative Party, and we're a long way off from a general election, and a lot can change, but at least the trajectory right now is looking positive.
Alex, it's been an absolute blast talking to you. Music to my ears. We're slightly cut from the same cloth, I think, aren't we? RC Blondes of Britain Unite. It's an absolute pleasure, and thank you, and highly recommend this documentary, Heresies, Britain's Silent Rape Explosion. Thank you.
A hugely interesting and deeply courageous interview, and indeed documentary there from Alex Phillips. I should declare an interest. I know Alex well. We work together a lot at GB News. That doesn't take anything away from the fact that she's made a really powerful documentary. And indeed, her and the team she worked with have done extremely well to winkle out data from the state statistical machine, data which the civil service is often very, very reluctant indeed to disclose.
It's hugely important, Liam. I think you can tell from how passionate Alex and I are about it, is that this change in our society is going on and we're not supposed to discuss it. And I think that's one reason why, going back to the JD Vance stuff, when you actually hear a politician being honest about what's happening to European culture and some of the stats that we discussed about the harrowing trends in Western Europe in assaults and the overrepresentation, huge overrepresentation of men from the Middle East and North Africa. And what's being done about it, Liam? It is absolutely shocking. And I think Alex and I do both wonder where it will all end, because it sure as hell isn't going to get any better. And I should just say, I think Alex is, people always say, where is our new Margaret Thatcher? I think Alex Phillips has got the courage and nous of a young Margaret Thatcher. And I will be very interested to see if she returns to politics, because I think she would be a serious leader of our country in the future. That's how highly I rate her.
This ties in, of course, with something I mentioned at the top, Baroness Sue Carr, the Lady Chief Justice, of course, of England and Wales, who chided Kemi Badenoch and then indeed Keir Starmer, because the leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, she, on PMQs last week, she said to the Prime Minister, is it really right that a judge has allowed refugees in from Palestine under a scheme designed to help Ukrainian refugees? In the light of warnings from law enforcers and indeed security services, that kind of legal ruling could bring about a situation where people are coming from Palestine who may well be seasoned terrorists, because our refugee system, for all its benefits over the years, has become so pockmarked, if you like, so loose in many ways, letting so many people in without proper checks into their background, that a lot of the public is really worried about this. And indeed, we discussed it last week on Planet Normal. And now Baroness Sue Carr is publicly chiding Kemi Badenoch and Keir Starmer. Both of them, Kemi Badenoch's a trained lawyer, right? So Keir Starmer's obviously a trained lawyer. He's a KC. They know what they're doing. And of course, we all understand the constitutional dangers of politicians trying to second guess judges, but that's before a judgment is made, right? You can't have a politician trying to steer a judge before a judgment is made. But surely, Baroness Sue Carr, it's okay if elected people in areas of the law where there is massive public concern, rightly so, not least among women for their safety, surely elected politicians can discuss legal outcomes from the sanctity of the House of Commons at the dispatch box during Prime Minister's questions. What's your problem, Lady Chief Justice?
I agree with you, Liam. I think it's absolutely incredible, breathtaking arrogance. And doesn't it then tap into what we've been talking about with Lord Hermer, the Attorney General? We seem to have this very left-leaning judicial and legal establishment who act as if they are literally a law unto themselves. And Lady Chief Justice Carr accusing the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition of failing to respect and protect judges like this chap, Hugo Norton-Taylor, who blithely waved in 6 Palestinians, in a decision which could open the floodgates to thousands of people, Hamas-influenced people coming from Gaza, which is absolutely not what, apart from a few very selected people like this. They speak for their own caste, Liam, don't they? And we are seeing human rights cases. The Telegraph, Planet Normal listeners might like to look up some of the Telegraph's more outlandish examples of the judgments of these immigration tribunals, where the main concern is the comfort and well-being of the illegal people who we are trying to get rid of, not the safety of the British people. And we have got these increasingly bizarre and expansive interpretations of the ECHR clauses to the detriment of the British public. So I think you're right. Lady Chief Justice Carr needs to on your bike, missus.
I've got a suggestion for Baroness Sue Carr.
Here we go.
Why doesn't she spend some time, it's on YouTube, watching 2 pieces of film? The first is the speech by Kemi Badenoch, Leader of the Opposition, at the ARC conference, which I thought was a good speech.
Yes, it was.
Which in part dealt with this issue. And the second film is Alex Phillips's documentary. Baroness Sue Carr probably doesn't like me very much, or you, Allison, and I'm sure she doesn't like Alex Phillips. But there is the link in the show notes to this episode to Alex's documentary, which is absolutely rooted in fact, official figures from across Europe and the world. It deserves to be watched, not least by Britain's snooty judges. Now on to our listener emails. Keep them coming. We learn so much from you, the citizens of Planet Normal.
Here's a lovely one, Liam. This is from someone called Anonymous P, a frustrated teenager from a small town in Kent. Dear inhabitants of the Rocket of Right Thinking, I wanted to write to you to let you know of a new concept my dad recently coined, and which has become a key weapon in our family survival against the progressive left, the woke cloak.
Harry Potter.
Similar to Harry Potter's cloak of invisibility.
That's brilliant.
Yes. We now don our woke cloaks when leaving our home, our outpost of reasonableness orbiting Planet Normal. This allows us to navigate life amongst the wokerati and is particularly useful for me at school. My woke cloak allows me to observe comments from friends and, believe it or not, even teachers, safely knowing that I'm free from cancellation. But sometimes I think, are others also wearing similar woke cloaks, or are they just so brainwashed they don't understand or even see what these comments represent? I now poke my head out from under my woke cloak, says Anonymous P, more and more when talking to my friends, always retreating under its safety before I say something that could be considered controversial, just by sharing views I'm perfectly entitled to have on topics such as immigration and women's rights to private spaces, etc. I've been listening to your podcast now for 2 years and I love it. So much so that it's inspired me to, wait for it, Halligan, study economics and politics at A-level. Hey! I feel I should be proud of my country, but what I see makes me wince and cringe at the absurdity of some things that are going on at the moment. Thank you. Well, thank you. It's great, isn't it, Liam, to hear from young people.
Now, we asked for suggestions for possible locations for a Planet Normal live event outside London soon. And discussions have been going on at the Telegraph to make sure such events happen. Kimberly says, my husband and I have listened to the podcast every week for years now. We'd love to attend a future Planet Normal event and would like to suggest holding one in South Wales. Hooray! The co-pilot stomping ground. We live in Pembroke, which is just an hour west of Alison's hometown of Llanelli. How's that?
That was pretty good. Llanelli.
Not bad. Yeah. Thanks for all the blood, sweat and tears you put into creating such a fantastic podcast, says Kimberly. Warmest regards. Then Anthony says, dear Allison and Liam, may I humbly suggest Basingstoke as the perfect venue. New York, Paris, Basingstoke, it trips off the tongue. We have the Anvil Concert Hall with seating for 1,400, the third best acoustics in the country. As everyone knows, the railway station opposite the entrance with links to the north and west. What's not to like? It even has a somewhat down-market image. Like the two of us, Alison, with huge affection for both of you for the outstanding work you are doing, says Anthony. And Nicole writes, Dear Alison and Liam, please come to the heart of England, i.e. Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire, which will be easily accessible for everyone. And indeed, easy for me.
Well, all good suggestions. So if you've got any more, just do say, where would you like the co-pilot and I to bring our down market show to? Coming soon to a room above a pub near you. Now, we had a lot of feedback to Jess's email last week, which was rather plaintively trying to find a partner amongst the Planet Normal gentlemen, somewhat similar to co-pilot Halligan. So Gemma says, Hi, Alison and Liam. As a long-time listener and massive fan and former proud winner of a Planet Normal mug, which is displayed
Gemma.
in its own cabinet.
In its own cabinet,
In its own cabinet. I had to write in response to Jess's email about finding a like-minded partner. I have to say I've had the same thoughts, says Gemma. I think that if I did outlive my husband, I'm only in my late 40s now, but I expect Planet Normal to continue for decades.
Of course.
And I would only be interested in a Planet Normal listening gentleman just like Liam, or just a jolly fun friend for me like Alison. Good luck to Jess in her search for a mate. Keep up the amazing work you both do. It means so much to me and to so many, says Gemma. And Lalu says, Hello, Alison and Liam. I just rushed to my computer to write this, having finished your podcast with Jess's email still lingering in my mind. Except I'm not the male she is looking for, rather a fan who is suggesting you start a Planet Normal dating site for like-minded people. I'll keep this brief, but your podcast is so informative and light, even though the subjects you discuss are serious. You're masters of the art of podcasting. Thank you so much, Lalu. Well, look, I think, we have our strengths, but I'm not sure on dating. I'm not sure. What do we think? Planet Normal dating app. If you need to get off with someone, just write to us and we'll put the word out.
We certainly will.
We will.
Now, of course, last week we marked the 50th anniversary of Margaret Thatcher becoming the Conservative leader back in 1975, and that sparked John to write this about his memories of Margaret Thatcher. Dear Alison and Liam, your piece, which included some thoughts on Maggie Thatcher, brought a tear to my eye. Now there was a real leader, the likes of which we haven't seen since. If you look at what really defines a leader, charisma, great oratory and conviction, principles, I don't think we've seen that in any politician recently. Just a quick anecdote. I once met Dennis Thatcher when he was on the board of a Burma oil subsidiary. I was giving a presentation to the board and Dennis was so human, gentle and supportive that I could well understand why Maggie relied on him so much. Nigel Farage also recalls spending time with Dennis in their London club, and he recalls fondly that meeting Dennis showed him, that's Nigel, that he really didn't have a drink problem after all. A lovely man and a great support to Margaret Thatcher throughout all the stress she had to handle fighting the wets and the establishment.
And this is from Richard. Dear co-pilots, one of the reasons I love Planet Normal is I feel I have so much in common with you both. Like Alison, I was brought up in South Wales. Like Liam, mine was an Irish family, albeit a couple of generations further removed. Later, I went to Liam's university to study Alison's subject. It's no wonder I agree with you about almost everything. Also, like you, I felt ambivalent about Margaret Thatcher when I lived through her era as a teenager. My parents believed she was evil made flesh, partly because of her attitude towards Irish republicanism, partly because of her stance on trade unions. In her first term, her government made my father and virtually every other man in my family redundant from the steel industry. Liam mentioned his paper round. I did one too. And like him, I used to read the news as I made my deliveries. 90% of customers where we were took the Mirror, like my parents. But I was fascinated by the broadsheets. I'd spent some of the money I earned from the paper round on newspapers for myself, particularly the Andrew Neil version of the Sunday Times. Great paper that was, that had caught most of the zeitgeist. In some ways, says Richard, I've spent my whole life arguing in my head with my parents about Thatcherism. They took an emotional, tribal approach to politics, and I could never have had this debate with them. But as a teenager, I was intrigued by the political arguments of the day, and I wanted to make up my own mind who was right. The older I got, the more my head told me that Thatcher had won the arguments, particularly on the economy. It wasn't easy to get my heart to agree, though. So I found myself mighty relieved when Tony Blair took over the Labour Party and allowed me to vote for Thatcher-style politics without betraying my tribe. Perhaps it was never that simple, says Richard, but it hasn't been until middle age that I've been comfortable with admitting that my head was always right and my heart and my beloved parents were wrong. Margaret Thatcher stands alone as the clearly preeminent Prime Minister of the post-war era, and how we could do with a worthy successor to her right now. I was fascinated by your analysis of Kemi Badenoch's performance and share your sense that she is pulling her punches and treading a bit too carefully for now. I'm not sure whether she's a Thatcherite in charge of a party of wets or a former Thatcherite who has been absorbed Gove-like into the centrist blob that seems to have control of the Conservative Party. One way or another, I hope she will break her promise not to work with reform. Perhaps there's no one of Thatcher's calibre in current politics, but if the two parties work together, they might be able to get halfway there. Best wishes and congratulations on the many stunning episodes in recent weeks, Richard. Well, Richard, what a wonderfully nuanced email. I think, Liam, something that we could both very strongly relate to.
And finally, Allison, he struck again, Bob the Bard. There have been various poetic pretenders in recent weeks, but then Bob bides his time and delivers again. His real name isn't even Bob, but he has won lots of mugs. Dear Planet Normal, as the United States turns its back on DEI, which is, of course, diversity, equity and inclusion, it makes me wonder, says Bob, how this will affect Britain's diversity industry. Although I think it will be quite some time before we see a reduction in pointless diversity jobs in our public sector, I suspect that those in similar roles in the private sector could soon be facing the chop and should therefore start updating their CVs. Thanks again for Planet Normal, the podcast that champions a colourblind meritocracy. Regards, in inverted commas, Bob. P.S. Before the poem, I think that Jess, last week's mug winner, sounds absolutely lovely, and I'm sure that her fantastic email has won her many potential suitors. Sadly, I can't be one of them, since I don't think Mrs. Bob would approve. Anyway, good luck, Jess. Your beau is out there somewhere, and I sincerely hope that you find him soon. So this is Bob the Bard. Drum roll. The writing's on the wall. Here we go. If diversity and inclusion is what your job's about, then I'm sorry to have to tell you, but your time is running out. You'll have to find another way to earn yourself some dosh, because American corporations are ditching all this tosh. Now you may think that you are safe. You may wonder, why the fuss? But a revolution started, and it's heading now for us. They're scrapping all the quotas, the pronouns and the lies, the courses and the claptrap. It's the death of DEI. So to those who work in wokery, I've a message to you all. Find yourself a proper job. The writing's on the wall. Hooray!
Brilliant.
And on that bombshell, that's it from Planet Normal for another week. So we leave our sanctuary of sweet reason, our flying refuge of reason views. Email of the week, co-pilot.
Well, I just want to say, Bob, I love the word tosh.
Oh,
Thank
tosh.
you for working.
And claptrap.
Tosh.
Oh,
Claptrap.
fantastic.
Absolutely.
Words of the week every week.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and we're going to give 2 mugs.
Oh.
2 mugs.
You're just trying to get rid of all the old ones with Fatty Allison and Fatty Liam, so we can phase in the pipe cleaner Allison one earlier. Oh, I know your ways. Telegraph cost control. We can't waste mugs, can we?
Yeah, so Planet Normal Mug 2, Anonymous P, our frustrated teenager who wrote to us from a small town in Kent about the woke cloak. Absolutely brilliant. And please email us at Planet Normal with your name and your full address, please. And to Richard for his absolutely splendid and stirring email about how he came to terms with loving Margaret Thatcher, coming from a Labour voting working class background, also like some of us. So Richard, just send us your full name and address.
To planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. And if you enjoy this podcast, do subscribe, leave us a rating and a review on Spotify, the podcast app, or wherever you listen. It helps others to find us and the Planet Normal family to grow. And as we speed away from our beloved Planet Normal once more, the madness of planet Earth comes back into view. Thanks as ever to our producers Isabel Bouchard, Cass Ho and Louisa Wells. Stay safe and in touch with us and with each other. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.